we'll get really rolling here in just a second, but I'll just do some like preliminary stuff. So this is the first ever, don't want that. First ever keynote panel from the Community Geographies Collaborative, which is super exciting. For those of you who don't know about the group, we are a group that we started with NSF grant funded conference back in 2019. And there's been some meetings and work since then to kind of plan a community of folks who are interested in doing community engaged research using a lot of techniques from like participatory methods, but also thinking about the kinds of structural models that can inform doing this type of work and support it institutionally. And so that's one of the main focuses of this group, as well as just resourcing and connecting people who are interested in doing community engaged scholarship in various kinds of ways. We exist kind of as a specialty group. There's also a Community Geographies Collaborative that's beyond just the specialty group. So our main mailing list is actually just a Google group. That's the main emailing list. So anybody can just sign up for that, and you don't have to be an AAG member that way. That said, I'm excited that we're having this panel today, and you probably are wondering who I am, some of you. I'm Jerry Shannon. I'm a faculty member at University of Georgia. I'm moderating this panel today. I'm also the outgoing chair of the Community Geographies Collaborative Specialty Group. So I'm really excited about this panel today. We have three amazing panelists. I was telling them beforehand, or at least Aaron and Kate, because they are present here, that, when we were talking about who to invite for this panel, these are the names that we kind of came up with at first. I'm like, well, we might as well ask them. They're probably busy and they're going to have other better things to do. And they all said yes, and it was super amazing. So I'm very excited that they all decided to spend time sharing their work with us and sharing their thoughts with us today. Let me first just talk about the format of this panel, and then I'll do an introduction, and they're all going to talk a little bit, and then there'll be some time for conversation. So each of them, prior to this, we're doing a workshop model this year where we invite folks in different workshops. We've done 3 prior to this, one just a few months ago, that are on the website, cgcollaborative.org, to write a short blog post relevant to the topic at hand. Right. So the first workshop that we did this year was called Getting Credit for Community Engaged Research, and kind of thinking about how we make this research legible within the institutions that we inhabit. This one's Going Public with Community Engaged Research, and thinking about research products and where these things live once they're kind of presented. So those blog posts are available on the website. There'll be a link here in a second where you can look at those. And then the intention is these panels are a conversation about what people wrote in those. So it gives us a chance to kind of read and reflect and respond to those things. So the format today is going to be each of our panelists is going to speak for 3 to 5 minutes or so about the topic that they wrote about. They won't necessarily read the whole thing, but they'll give you kind of an overview. And then we'll launch into a time of questions and answers. That some of that might be questions that we talk about up here, but there's also going to be plenty of time for conversation with you all who are out in the physical audience, and I believe the virtual audience too. Are you the one who checks on chat, or how do we know if there's a chat? You do that. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thank you. This is one of those like first time hybrid event at AAG. We're figuring out how this works. So without further ado, let me introduce our fine panelists. I'm just doing them alphabetical last name order. Kate Derrickson is Associate Professor of Geography at the University of Minnesota, my alma mater. She's Director of the Urban Studies Program and Co-Director of the CREATE Initiative. She's a longtime member of the Gullah Geechee Sustainability Think Tank and an editor at Environment and Planning D, Society and Space. Dr. Robert Lee, who is joining us virtually from the UK, is an Associate Professor of US History at the University of Cambridge and was the PI on the Land Grab Universities project, which if you don't know that project, you should. He has a PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley, and an MA in American Studies from the University of Heidelberg. Before coming to Cambridge, he was a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. And lastly, Dr. Aaron McElroy is an assistant professor of American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, as co-founder of both the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which you should also know about, and the Radical Housing Journal. At UT, Aaron also runs the Anti-Eviction Lab and the Landlord Tech Watch. Let's give them all a round of applause. And do you all mind, maybe we can just do that same order for speaking? Does that sound good?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to invite Kate first to talk about what she shared.
Am I staying here?
Yeah, you can
Okay.
speak right and make sure you speak in the microphone.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you, Jerry, and to the Community Geographies group for organizing this. It's wonderful to be here. It's kind of unusual to give 3 minutes of comments, but I'll do my best.
Or if you want to give
I don't. No. And you can go. Wait, aren't they supposed to get the QR code?
thank
Yeah.
you. Can you get the QR code?
So I guess the main points that I wanted to talk about, the provocation was, how do you get your work out into the world, and what are some of the considerations there? And so kind of key points that I wanted to mention and that I talk about in the blog post is that, the first thing I thought about when I was responding to this was, what kind of community engaged work do I do? And mine is really specifically about working with established constituted groups. So I don't, I have colleagues who do work that kind of calls a group into being, but I don't do that for a number of different reasons, and we can talk about that. And so that means that I always have a collaborator or a community to whom I'm accountable or in collaboration with, who can set the kind of terms of our research and can work together with me and my students to identify the things that they both want to do research about, and the kinds of public facing products or internal products that they desire. And so that's different from, like, if you're doing other kinds of work that don't have particular people that you can, brainstorm this stuff with. And so that means that we've done things like story maps that were kind of came out of a class that I co-taught with my collaborators. I've worked with the Gullah Geechee Sustainability Think Tank, as Jerry mentioned. And that story map has a public facing, readily available piece that you can link to, I think, through the blog post. Yeah.
It's actually on the page here.
Yeah. But that also has a back end. So the story map is about telling the history and contemporary story of Gullah Geechee people on St. Helena Island from their perspective, and it highlights the things that are important and matter to them. There's also a back end that you can't see that has a repository of data that we've collected that they don't want to be public, about things like where heirs property is, about things where burial grounds are. And so those are two different kinds of products that we've produced, one of which is public, one of which isn't. So I wanted to talk about that, and I talk about that in the blog post. And I don't know, am I 3 minutes up? Okay. The other thing I wanted to talk about was this initiative that Jerry mentioned called the CREATE initiative. So CREATE was established by myself and Dr. Bonnie Keeler at the University of Minnesota. And this was actually a case where we were sort of creating something new. And to do that, we established a policy think tank. And so we worked with a number of community-based organizations and grass tops leaders, I guess I would call them, to constitute a think tank that could help us figure out what research they wanted. So our main goal here is to mobilize the resources of the research university to ask and answer questions that are a priority to our collaborators. And so the think tank that we put together to advise us has been great for both helping us figure out what the public facing things that they want are, but also to kind of iterate with us about the scholarly research, which is a kind of whole different beast that we do not have time to talk about, but it is something I wanted to put out on the table, which is the simultaneity of doing this public facing, community engaged, accountable work and scholarly work at the same time. And those are not always the same. They don't always have the same methods. They don't have the same audiences. They don't ask the same questions. And that think tank has been a great resource for us to kind of work together to do both of those things at the same time. Okay.
Great. There you go. Our second speaker is going to be Bobby Lee. I believe you go by Bobby, right? Yep. Robert Lee at Cambridge. And so we're going to switch over to his Zoom.
Okay, great. Can I just get a thumbs up or something if people can hear me? Just so I'm not talking into the void here. Well, thank you for having me virtually here. I jumped at the chance to be able to participate in this panel. It's been a rough couple of years for everyone, I think. But one of the silver linings for academics who might study the United States and not live in the United States is the possibility to have these types of connections and to participate in these events virtually, which is really wonderful. It's not my first time at the AAGs. I'm a historian, but I feel a sort of a kinship with the AAG. This is my third time, so I'm happy to be back, at least virtually. So our topic today was sort of research beyond academic publications, and that certainly fits the mold of the project that I'm here to talk about. So land grab universities is about land grant universities, and this project was really a history journalism collaboration, and it was trying to find ways to really, along similar lines. So Kate was just mentioning to find new ways of doing scholarship that fulfills multiple roles at the same time, sort of simultaneously speaking to academics and speaking to policymakers and broader publics, but using a core of academic research and finding new ways to deliver that material. So the Land Grab Universities project was, if you don't know about it, it was about the Morrill Act of 1862. This is the law in the 19th century that creates the land grant college system in the United States. And it was a geodatabase driven project. The objective or the goal of the project was to identify all of the land that was seized from indigenous nations and redistributed through the Morrill Act to land grant universities across the United States. And so it was the core of the research was really a geodatabase that we had to figure out how to best communicate our findings. So the results of that, the results of the project was that we were able to identify pretty much all of the Morrill Act parcels that were distributed. It's roughly 11 million acres worth of land across 24 different states for the benefit of 52 universities. And this land had been taken through seizures, treaties, unratified treaties from approximately 250 different tribal nations. And we were sort of able to break down that picture geographically. And the way that we packaged the project for publication was as a sort of a multimedia work of history journalism, where we had a long form magazine article and at the same time a interactive a website with interactive maps that we built, so users could sort of choose their own adventure through the data. And then a series of, the data itself, a sort of publicly available database, and then methodology and bibliographical essays. So how did this whole thing come about? I mean, I'm not a journalist, I'm a historian. And in the blog post, I sort of tell a little bit of the story of this. I'd been working on this in this area, but one of the things that I knew early on working with it was that it really wasn't, or I didn't think it was, it would be best served through traditional academic publishing routes, right? As a research article or as a monograph. It had this large geodatabase component to it that would fit well with a digital format, but it also had real possible policy implications. So the hope was to put this material out as fast as possible and to have it in a form that would hopefully have the widest reach as possible. But I didn't really know how to do that early on. And I sort of was giving presentations on the material that I had, and in those presentations, I was I would end as sort of with like a call for help. And I gave one of these presentations, and Tristan Atone, who became my main collaborator, my co-author on this project, he was in the audience. He is a journalist. He was running a tribal affairs desk at High Country News at the time. And together we built up a collaboration where I was doing the research and Tristan was doing the investigative reporting part. We recruited photographers, coders, web designers, all to be able to put together this project in about 2 years, which maybe someone working on their own might have taken 5 or 10 years to produce a book or a journal article. But we published it in 2020. Right as a pandemic was starting, which was not the best time to publish. I know I'm probably taking up too much time here, so I can talk more about how this came about and how the collaboration worked, but I just wanted to sort of flag up a couple of things, sort of the challenges that are involved in a project like this. One is sort of rethinking publication itself. How do we go about pursuing scholarship that's rigorous, that has a clear methodology, building evidence-based arguments, and packaging that for wider publics. That is really an art unto itself, I think, and it's worth thinking about sort of overtly. Another area is, I think, how we think about interdisciplinary work. There are different modes in which scholars do interdisciplinary work. Some is like with collaborators within the university, sometimes it's with community engagement. But I also think it's really important to think about how academics work with sort of other sectors of professionals, people in nonprofits or journalists who have different skill sets, but often complementary interests. For me, working with the Native American Journalists Association was a really important link. Another area is like building teams. How do you build teams that can do this type of work? I mean, we tend to run in sort of circles with people in our own fields, but often the best collaborative work sort of comes out of finding collaborators who can play complementary roles. Another thing we're talking about probably too is funding. It was kind of difficult getting funding for the project. I mean, it wound up being successful in the end, so it might be somewhat of a surprise. But it was really hard to convince some funders that, like journalism funders who thought it was too much history, and history funders who thought it was too much journalism, and finding ways to frame that type of work. Another area is worth thinking about, I think, along doing this type of work, collaborative work, is concessions and compromise, and that had to happen in the process of doing this project as well. But I think I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you so much, Bobby. That was great. Last speaker is Erin.
Okay. You'll see me. I sit here. I can't tell. Okay. The podium sort of. All right. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation to be part of this conversation. So in the blog post that I wrote, I mostly wrote about a project that I co-founded in 2013 called the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. So to give a little bit of context, around 2010 or so, I got involved in housing organizing in San Francisco. This was the aftermath of the foreclosure crisis. A decade before that, there had been the dot-com boom in which a bunch of tech capital incited waves of evictions and dispossession in the San Francisco and the broader San Francisco Bay Area. So in 2010, after a bunch of people had lost their homes through racialized foreclosure, we started to notice as housing organizers a wave of evictions. And so I became part of a group called Eviction Free San Francisco. It was a direct action mutual aid group, not academic, no funding. And we held meetings every 2 weeks, and anybody being evicted or harassed by their landlord could come to the meeting and talk about what was going on. And we would figure out if we had the capacity to work with them to organize direct actions against evictions. And then we would ask them to stick around and help other people fight their evictions. So that group lasted a few years. It doesn't exist anymore. Other groups do in the Bay Area. But one of the ongoing issues we had in that direct action work was that increasingly tenants were coming in and would say, I'm being evicted by some anonymous sounding shell company, but I don't know who my landlord is. And so another sort of aftermath of the foreclosure crisis was the rise of corporate landlordism and new structures of property ownership in which investment companies own, sometimes hundreds and hundreds of limited liability companies and limited partnership companies, LLCs, and each LLC might buy a building and then that LLC becomes the landlord. And so you might have this was a case that I was a part of. There were a 6-unit building at 55 Dolores Street in San Francisco was being evicted by 55 Dolores Street LLC. And that LLC had just bought their building that year. They didn't know who was behind that shell company, but they knew that they were being evicted. And so there was this sort of need for information in organizing in order to figure out who the landlord actually was, to figure out what other buildings that landlord owned, and then to kind of create a sort of multi-tenant, multi-building organizing network so you could have tenants across the city who happened to be living in buildings owned by what were shell companies of this investment company called Urban Green Investments. And so the goal was to bring tenants together, and hopefully Bobby's still there. And so, and basically organize together against evictions. And that model actually proved very successful. And that need for information was the genesis of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. So the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project formally started in 2013. We thought we would just make 1 or 2 maps of where evictions were. And the idea was you could click on the map online and figure out who the landlord was and what other buildings they owned, and then use that information in doing on-the-ground direct action work. It turned out that project was a lot more complex than we thought. And so we're still doing that work. Today, the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project operates in the Bay Area. We also have chapters in New York City and Los Angeles. And we've partnered with groups in other cities across the US and also internationally. We're a volunteer-based collective. So this is not a university project. It's a largely unfunded project. We have been writing grants as of late to compensate some folks for doing some of the tedious work that is often invisible labor that is really tiring. And having done this work myself for 10 years now, this is something to talk about, like how do we make these projects sustainable and not kind of tethered to the nonprofit industrial complex, and to exist successfully outside of academia, and what kinds of partnerships can exist that aren't extractive or exploitative with academia. And so I began this project before I was in grad school. I teach at UT, so I've kind of gone through this academic development throughout the project, but the project has remained external to the university. And one of my ongoing tasks is how do I leverage the resources that I have in academia to support the project. And one thing I wrote about in the blog post is, when it comes to academic scholarship, this project was never meant to be something that it was always meant to produce scholarship and to produce research that could be useful for organizing. It wasn't meant to, advance my CV or anybody else's in terms of peer-reviewed writing. But, at one point we started having people join the collective who were specifically interested in writing about us and making it advance their careers. And so there became this really weird vetting that we had to do. Like, okay, we do have an onboarding process and we do vet people to make sure their politics are aligned, but we can't police internally what people write about or say about the project necessarily. And so there's an ongoing sort of question in terms of who gets to write about it. What does authorship mean? What does co-authorship mean? We published an atlas in 2021 with PM Press and made the atlas specifically co-edited by the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. So it's not edited by me, it's not edited by a group of us, but rather the collective. But there are always, there are at this point peer review pieces that I've written collectively with other members about the project, in part because we wanted to write against some of the writing about us. And so it's that's kind of how some of this started to circulate in peer-reviewed sources. But most of the work that we do is produced in forms like reports, zines, murals. We have a piece of software we've been developing called a Victor Book, which lets you type in your address or type in your landlord's shell company and figure out now all of the different buildings associated with it. And so that's most of the work that we do. We also sometimes produce public scholarship in various blogs and journals that are open access. So I think that there's a lot to talk about there in terms of publication and authorship and co-authorship. And I'd be happy to talk more in this conversation about that and how to leverage university resources to advance projects that are fiercely independent of academia too. So, yeah.
Thank you all. I think just to start with, when we do the quote response piece here, just as a way to kind of prime the pump for some conversation. So beforehand, I kind of selected a couple of quotes from each of these blogs and encouraged our panelists to kind of look them over and think through if there's something that somebody else said essentially that they wanted to respond or react to. And so I'm just going to open the floor if any of you have things, or I can certainly pick out a quote. Yeah.
I have one.
Okay. Sounds good. Which one is it?
The last quote by Aaron, which is kind of where you ended up.
Yeah.
there.
So I'll just read it real quick.
Okay.
Or Aaron, do you want to read it? Is it weird that I read it when you're sitting right here?
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Why don't you just read it real quick?
Okay. So I think I just actually said this, but this is the
Well,
quote.
yeah, let it be at that if you want.
Yeah, I mean, did I say this? Yeah, that I just said this. It's about people joining the project or other academics kind of extracting some of our information.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is one of the most complicated parts of doing community engaged or work that is accountable to a community or for politics as an academic. And it's very easy to have two tracks, like what you described, right? Like it's very easy to say, okay, these are the resources I have to hand, and I'm going to use them to, I don't want to say it's easy, but it's clear to me how to do that. You can mobilize the resources of the research university, you can use your classroom, you can use, all different kinds of resources that you have to hand. But it becomes much more complicated when you try to know in a scholarly way or contribute to scholarly literature based on the things that you're talking about, doing research on. And that kind of complexity, I think, is oftentimes, I think in community engaged research, we just kind of punt on, or I'll speak for myself. I've just kind of punted on and just been sort of like, these are two tracks and it's not complicated. I just do these two separate things. But that's actually felt less satisfying to me recently, because the whole reason why the people I work with want to work with me is because I'm an academic. And if I were a program officer at a foundation, I'd probably be way better at getting resources and things to community partners. So I've been thinking a lot in the last couple of years about what is it about academics that make communities want to work with us. And yes, I think my partners want, the story map, and they want the research that we do and all that. They also want to shape the disciplines. They also want their experiences, their worldviews, their cosmologies, their problematics to not just be like a case study, right? They want it to change how we think about not just their lived experience, but like the social formations that they're struggling in and against. And I've been really eager in the past few years to do a better job integrating those two things. And it's just feeling increasingly less satisfying to say these are two separate things. But then, as you say, it raises all these questions about like risk and accountability and benefit and opportunity and cost, and that feeling of like, I might be better off in the world because of my knowledge about your dispossession is not a good place to work from. And so that's just the nut of the problem that I've been trying to think through for the past couple of years. And so when I read that quote, it just brought a lot of that up for me.
Sure, if you want, if you feel like you have something to say, or is that good?
Sure. I mean, yeah, no, I think that it's really tricky. And I think that, one of the things I've been excited about thinking about more broadly is like what is research? What is scholarship? What might research as organizing look like, or what might organizing as research look like outside of the sort of boundaries of, academia as we normative academia. But there's also, I think there's a lot to say about people who then also frame their work as sometimes scholar activist work, but aren't, maybe letting the communities that they work with lead. And it's sort of the centering of the researcher rather than the centering of like, okay, let's stop evictions. That's the issue. Whether or not this tool exists or whether or not I exist, the point is to do something that has a material effect in yeah, and also the community can be so problematic. I mean, as you were saying, so there's a lot of trouble, I think, in terms of these categories, and I think I'm excited about the conversations in this space, just about how we're troubling that. Yeah.
No, good. I'm just going to pick a second one, and then we'll open the floor for questions. And this is a quote that was in Bobby's blog, but I think it comes to questions about genre, and I think it's relevant to all the folks on this panel, because all of you have kind of worked with research that is digital in some ways, and thinking about digital formats, or digital or non-textual, right? So anti-eviction mapping project, I just had a conversation in the class this week about murals and public art and things like that, right? So this is what Bobby wrote. Newspaper reporting, university reports, and websites had become one of the most compelling avenues for publishing new research in how universities were materially entangled with histories of colonization. Few of these studies were single author and made all the better for it. They certainly seem to be faster to print, which matters for work with potential policy implications. And as a historian using digital methods to scale up research, I also doubted if books or articles were well suited to publishing geodatabase-driven research. Non-digital formats could scarcely demonstrate the depth and range of finding for readers. And so a little kind of Marshall McLuhan, like mediums of sharing research, like how has that mattered for all of you as you think about the kinds of ways that the work, the scholarship that you do and the partnerships you pursue go public? That's for anyone who wants to respond. So Bobby, you could have, this is kind of his quote. So why don't we have one of you all do this, and then he can speak to it too. Or did any of you?
Okay. I think, one of the things that the story map format is so compelling to our collaborators, and we've made so many story maps, and it's fraught, it's an Esri product and all that kind of stuff, and it has to be housed at the University of Minnesota, so there's all kind of complicated dynamics around people being able to edit it, and where does it live, and who has control over it. But the ability to share a link and make that link searchable, so that when you Google Gullah Geechee, it's one of the first things that comes up. That is what my collaborators wanted. They wanted, if people were like, oh, Gullah Geechee, what's that? They wanted to be the first thing. They wanted their voice to be the first thing that anyone found about that. And then they wanted their contact information at the bottom of it, so that anybody who had any questions about Gullah Geechee people, their livelihoods, what was going on with them, that's who they would reach out to. And so this, a journal article can't accomplish that, obviously. And a University of Minnesota website can't really accomplish that. And so being able to kind of create this digital project that's using the University of Minnesota, but has no trait. There's no M, I don't think, anywhere on there. It's just, it looks like it came from Gullah Geechee Nation. And like I said, there's no way to get that kind of reach. And the other thing I'll say about it is that it's so multimedia and interactive. So, a thing that was really important to them was to be able to put voices on there, and to be able to have people speaking Gullah, and to be able to have sound and moving images, so that people could feel the place and relate to the place in a way. And, and the last thing I'll say is that we can change it all the time. It's editable. So, we can keep adding to it. We keep growing the geography that it refers to. And so then we just kind of link them all together. And so that kind of non-permanent nature and evolving, building nature of that digital product has been really important as well.
Bobby, is there anything more you want to say on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to fill in a little bit about this, the quote here and how it relates to the land grab project. I mean, thinking about genre was really critical here. I mean, foundational for the project was all of this work that's been going on related to understanding the connections between the transatlantic slave trade and universities, both in the United States, in Europe. elsewhere more and more. This work sort of exploded after the Brown Report in 2006. It spread all around the country and elsewhere. And there's a clear content, like intellectual connection between the type of study that land grab universities is and the type of studies that were going on and are going on in relationship to the slave trade and universities. But what really stood out to me when I started doing this work was not just the link between, okay, these are different forms of colonial extraction that are going on with universities. It's how they're building up their material base through connections to slavery, through connections to indigenous dispossession. But the way in which these studies were coming out, it was really non-academic work. I sort of bristle at the idea of research beyond academic publication, because that begs a question. Can a newspaper be an academic publication? I think it can be. Can a website be an academic publication? I think it can be. I think it has to do with the methodologies that go into the work. But it was the reports, it was the websites. It was this committee work that was going on at a lot of universities, and it was the newspaper reporting, like the New York Times work on the Georgetown University and others, that was really leading the way. And that really signaled to me that like the best way to go about studying the history of land grant universities, if your goal is to have a policy impact, is to follow this newer emerging model in order to publish this research. And then there was this whole methodological side to that, asking what really is the most effective means for communicating this material. I mean, we first put out this magazine article, which is really a traditional publication. I think most people read it online, but there's a physical hard copy, that was on newsstands, at one point in time. I don't think as many people see it that way as in the digital format. But it's really the website that gets the most attention, certainly gets the most traffic, and is used the most, because it allows users to really explore the material that we collected to the fullest extent. Really, when you think about the sort of the article that we put out, it had a hard limit of 5,000 words for a long form magazine piece. And we could only sort of scratch the surface of the material that we collected. And what the website enables users to do is really to sort of choose their own adventure through the data and to find stories that they're interested in. So it was these sort of emerging, I would call them emerging academic publications. I would like to see them mainstreamed as academic publications, although that might be too much of an ask at the moment.
Cool, thank you. Erin, is there anything you wanted to say on this?
Sure. Let's see. So yeah, it's interesting to think about like how to get information out there and what information is needed. And when we look at our own website, the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project's website, the sort of top searches are the landlords themselves. I think because so many of them hide behind these shell companies, it's been important for tenants to go into a search engine and type in, 55 Dolores Street LLC and see that it's actually this investment company or whatever it might be. So that is a resource we continue to put a lot of energy into. But we also, I think, began to coming out of housing organizing in a very non-digital way. I think sometimes it can feel like there's a sort of disconnect that can happen when you're doing all this work online from the work that you're doing offline. And so it's been really important for us to not just do digital work. So we also make zines, we make murals, we do a lot of oral history work. One of our murals in San Francisco is a Call the Wall mural. So it's a mural that we painted with muralists who are part of our collective. And there's a phone number you can call if you pass by it and hear different stories, different oral histories of tenants who not only have been evicted, but who have actually successfully fought back against their evictions, because there's a lot of knowledge there to be shared with passersby about how to successfully stay in your home, even if you have an abusive landlord, which doesn't always work, but sometimes does, and often through direct action and mutual aid and multi-building organizing, if that's possible. So one of our zines too, it's called We Are Here, and it's actually all kind of victory stories about how tenants were able to stay in their homes. And we make those for free and self-publish them on paper, kind of old school zine style. So we also have some films that we've made. So of course, we're called the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. So we make maps, but lots of other things too, both digitally and not. And I think that sort of interaction between the digital and the non-digital is always one that we put a lot of energy into thinking and rethinking. So I think also for accessibility, because not everybody's online. So yeah.
Okay, so at this point, we'll open the floor here. If you do have questions, you need to come up to the microphone because there's Zoom people. So yeah.
Hi, I'm Lisa Seamus. I'm with staff at AAG, and I'm bringing you a question from one of our participants. Is there a recommended guideline available for going public with community engaged work?
That's a good question. Recommended by whom would be my first question, right? Like, maybe another way to think about it, like, are there particular resources or people that you all look to, who kind of have given you some frameworks that you feel like are useful for thinking about how to do public work, public scholarship?
Sure. I mean, the community that I primarily collaborate with has a manual of kind of conditions for successful conditions for collaboration. But in a more abstract way, I think a question that I always have is, what work will this do in the world? What's going to happen when we try to know about it, and what's going to happen when we circulate this knowledge out into the world, or this product or this finding. And that's where relationships of accountability and solidarity are so important, because I think, what I've learned over the last 15 years is that I can't anticipate. I think I know what's going to happen if we publish X, Y, or Z. But the people who are most affected by it have very clear senses of, like, this will make us more vulnerable. This isn't information that we want public. We don't want people to know where burial grounds are. So we don't want people to know where heirs' property is, because they will exploit that for their own purposes. And so I think the first principle is do no harm, but the second principle is figure out how to not do harm. And it's not as straightforward as it might seem in the ivory tower. It's really complicated and not predictable. And I've had a lot of people push back on the idea that we should care, or that we should try to anticipate what work it will do in the world. But to me, it's like, how is that not the animating question? Like, isn't that the point? Like, if the point is to change it, then let's have a clear understanding of the relationship between doing this work and changing it. And the people who are best positioned to answer that are not academics. It's the people who you're trying to who struggle and fight, you're trying to resource. And so I don't know if that's like a first principles, but those are like the first things that come to my mind about things you really have to keep in mind.
Can I?
Yeah, Bobby.
Oh, yeah, I wanted to add there. So for us, the project was not working with a particular Indigenous nation. We were national in scope, and the story connected to the histories of several hundred Indigenous nations, and there wasn't the capacity to build up connections to each nation before publication. So our strategy for making sure that the work that we were putting out into the world was going to attempt to try to do no harm was sensitivity reading. We didn't have peer reviewers for the project. I mean, it was a non-academic publication in that sense, because it was a magazine publication, but we did have sensitivity readers for the project, because we were discussing events like the the Dakota War and the hanging in 1862, Sand Creek Massacre. And so we wanted to have what we were putting into the story considered. So it went out to academics working in NACE, who were given the sort of remit of doing a sensitivity reading for the project. And it's something that I would recommend if you're doing this type of work, especially. I mean, there are logistical reasons that sort of limit, in terms of resources, what you can do before publication and the process of publication. But sensitivity reading is not, I don't think, outside the resources of most projects.
Yeah, I think I would say, when we got going, we were housed in the San Francisco Tenants Union, which has been around for decades and decades. Now we have different homes in our different chapters, but I learned a lot from one of my mentors, who's no longer with us, Ted Gullickson, who had been doing this work of actually identifying landlords and leading rent strikes for decades. And I was really nervous at first, like, what does it mean to publish this data about landlords? We do actually get letters from lawyers of landlords regularly threatening to sue us for defamation and things like that. We have a pro bono lawyer now, which is great. But I think just really consulting with people who've been doing this work and learning about their struggles and best practices. And yeah, I mean, even we have this oral history project called Narratives of Displacement and Resistance. And about a decade or so before we began, somebody named Nancy Mirabal had begun an oral history project in the Mission in San Francisco that she's written about. There's a beautiful article that she wrote about. So we consulted with her. So I think it's a lot about like learning about people who have already been doing this work, even if it's not exactly the same thing we're doing. It's, we're not reinventing the wheel, but we're also not starting anything that's brand new without precedence and without, a lot of, we're on the shoulders of these housing organizers and movements that have been around for a long time. So, yeah, I think I would just say that.
We have a question from the floor.
Sterling Johnson with Temple University, PhD student. And I'm at Temple, but I've been doing a lot of organizing in Philadelphia with our own organization, Philadelphia Housing Action, seen red counterpoints, with anti-eviction mapping project. And this is mainly for people that are dealing with people that are more marginalized, and how individuals are making kind of the edits on like what should be publishable online, what is publishable in a journal of some sort. I guess I'm mostly interested in some of these things that are like 5 to 7 to 10 years, when like somebody doesn't like to see their name when they're Googled and maybe their life has changed, and there's an attempt to remove that, which is very easy on a website that you control, but it's a lot harder when somebody like at least has some sort of ownership right over it. So I don't know if there have been issues, or maybe you can speak to them, but I feel like that's the point that I get, that I'm here for, where it's like, I think we've seen a few things, maybe I don't know, like some people have come out with letters against certain researchers saying that, like, how dare they say this is not how it went down, so I would like to, and I don't even know what happened there. I would like to avoid that but I only work with people that are incarcerated, all these things, of people that are, it really feels like you're making money off their fucking suffering, which really feels fucked up for me in a real way. So I'm just wondering what maybe responses to that would be, and even like what you would intend your response to that, even if people have come to you, because that's happened in the drug user realm too, where people have written, I don't know, Vancouver Drug User Union, they've written about the experience of drug users, and people have said that's actually not what happened. And so, but you have to have a response that isn't not terrible. So just thank you.
I go again. Okay. No, yeah, thank you for that. And thanks for I think that's like a really, really important question and one that doesn't get addressed enough in these spaces. So I would be excited for more people to talk about this too. And I would say for the mapping project, so we do a lot of oral history work, as I mentioned. We have developed what we call a double consent process for doing oral histories. So we have a consent form and kind of go through potential risks and harms of sharing stories with tenants before recording their stories, but then we have another consent process that we go through before we would publish it online and explain, okay, this is what could happen based on what we know. So your landlord might find this and try to use this against you in a court case, even 10 years from now. And like, are you okay with that? And if not, let us know. If you're not, even in a few years, you change your mind, let us know. But it gets trickier, like, as you said, if those oral histories gets transcribed, because that's like, we can't just go and erase that if it's published in a book. So that's something we've thought a lot about and continue to think about. But because we're not academic, we're not going through the IRB, and there are lots of problems with the IRB too. But we are trying to think through best practices and have learned from other people who are doing this kind of oral history work in ways that we find politically salient. But yeah, different communities are going to have there are going to be different risks. And I think doing work in jails and within incarcerated folks is super important. And people who get evicted are much more likely to become, subject to the carceral state. And that's an ongoing issue too. So there's a lot to think about. And I'd love to expand this beyond the three of us, but I don't know if either of you have.
Well, I think it's a really important point, and one that's like terrifying. I mean, it's really terrifying to think that you would have done something and that people perceive as or feel that harms people. But I think, and actually I'm thinking about Charmaine, because Charmaine and I had a conversation about this a couple of years ago, but the attachment to never being perceived as having done anything wrong is a powerful deterrent from doing anything. And the attachment to your reputation over and above the struggle is really debilitating. And I actually think makes people, it pulls you in two directions. It makes you more ethical in some ways, but I think it also screws up your compass sometimes. And because your own desire to be seen as right and good and infallible and morally just is so superseding like the urgency of the problem. And so I think it's all you can do is think really long and hard and in relation with people, and just I think you have to really be prepared when you're part of a struggle that people will circumstances will change, and you just have to trust that you did your best. And I think sometimes just recognize that the circumstances changed and it's really regrettable, and let's think about how we can repair it. But I guess that, just cautioning the way that our attachments to being seen as never being wrong shape or limit the things that we do.
So just a quick clarifying, I'll shout it so by the hour there is us as academics, or the hour there is the people we're working with, like the attachment. Because I could feel like part of this is are we willing to kind of sit in some of that, was this an ethical, kind of the gray areas in terms of dealing, or when you're saying that, who are the folks?
I mean, I mean academics, and there are examples of people saying, look, everybody can think of a million examples, but there's examples of people saying, look, this community they were working with has said, it actually went down like this. Isn't that so clearly obvious that this person was wrong? And I think anyone who's worked in community, especially in struggle, knows that shit happens and goes awry in the context of difficult, urgent trouble, and that you have to be willing to know that I don't mean the community necessarily. I mean, a researcher has to be ready to say I made a mistake, or the circumstances changed in a way that I couldn't predict. But you just have to trust I think you have to trust and triangulate.
Bobby, is there anything you want to say on this? Yeah, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to raise one issue, the sort of the flip side of this question, which is also worth thinking about, which is like, how do you provoke? And what is the most productive way to put out controversial material that will be provocative to some groups? I mean, for our project, I mean, the idea was to call out universities for their histories of profiting from the expropriation of indigenous land, and we had a lot of conversations about what was the best way to go about sort of presenting this material. We wound up, I mean, and I was sort of terrified too, because I didn't want any of the data to be wrong. We were going to each one of these universities saying, this is what we found. Do you know anything about this? Do you have any comment about it? And we went to each one of them, and some of them, I mean, most of them basically brushed us off and said they didn't have any comment. The AAUP said they didn't have any comment, but then when they heard that we were contacting all of the universities that we had data on, then they sort of contacted everyone as well, and they came out with like a group statement that they put together, and a bunch of the universities signed onto that. And we had a lot of discussions about, okay, how do we present this material? And we wound up just taking their comments that they sent us and putting them on the website, on the page that we had for each one of these universities, without any sort of editorial comment. But it was a big issue, because I mean, the point of the hope of the project was that it would have some sort of policy impact. And the question is like, how are you provocative in the most productive way in order to achieve policy outcomes that you're seeking? There on the one side, my co-author, I think he was a little bit harsher with the universities, and I was wanting to take a sort of a lighter touch, saying like, here's some information. If you act on it, it will paint you in a good light. But yeah, most of them didn't want to hear it. But we did get some contact afterwards, asking us if we would put a new statement up there, and we said no, we'll put up a new statement, but we're not going to take the original one down.
Well, we've got several questions lined up here, so I'm going to see if we can kind of keep things moving. Maybe just not have everyone respond to the next one, though I'm sure a lot of people have good things to say, but just in the interest of time. So yeah, stepping up to the mic.
Hey, comrades. I have a two-part question about anonymity and secrecy. The first is, I guess many of us go into academia because we want to make change, and then we realize that the kinds of change that require community engaged research require kind of anonymity and self-effacement that is actually structurally desensitized in the academy. And all of you up here, and I have good tenure track jobs. I'm curious if you could say something about, I come to this dilemma when advising grad students who want to do this work, if you could say something about the dilemma of then sort of having to be on a job market where there are no jobs and having to demonstrate things on a CV that then sort of take you out of the commitment that you have to community engaged research and into demonstrating a certain kind of, self-commodified profile, and what it means to think about those two things together. And I suppose the sort of related question is, how are you thinking about reshaping how we understand community engaged research within the university as a way to kind of like open up the possibility of us being able to do the kinds of collective writing that we do? And I guess the second part, anonymity question, is that some work requires, community engaged work requires actually not going public with it, but actually being very private about it, particularly given certain kinds of clandestine organizing that if you put public research out there actually sort of invites massive amounts of counterinsurgency from state forces, et cetera. And how you think about, once again, right, the question of sort of what it means to be doing work that has to be sort of secret by design, given our position in the academy.
All right, thanks. A lot of questions. Do we have maybe a couple of y'all want to respond to that?
I mean, I can just take a first stab, but yeah, I mean, the academic, the requirements of academia are harsh and brutal, as many of us know, and it really is a struggle. I mean, I think that I have now, I think maybe written almost autoethnographically about some of the very conversations we're having here, to reflect upon them. And then sometimes that might count, towards a journal article or something like this in a productive way. And I think there is something about doing that to help. I mean, part of it, we have to produce analysis that can help transform academia and make it slightly less of a violent place, so there's that political project too. And if we can do both of these at the same time, that's great. But yeah, most of the work though doesn't get counted. And I think, there are different programs in different universities that are working towards counting more work. And I'm excited to see those initiatives. There's so much more that's needed. I think for me, what it's sometimes like giving up on a life a little bit. It's like the academic work and then the organizing work. I mean, I have a life in both of those, but I don't have much time for anything else. So it's been really important for me to actually find and build community within organizing, because it really is a full-time job to do it well often enough. And it's I show up to work on Monday after having been on 7 Zoom meetings the day before, like ready for vacation already. And so I think there's a lot that's about sustainability and figuring out how to do it in a way that you don't burn out, because burnout is so easy. And it's so easy when you're doing kind of 2 projects that don't often seem to go together as much as they should, and both require, all of your being to keep them going. But I would say I'm really inspired by initiatives within universities that to count more, and I want to see more of that and work with others who are interested.
One quick example of something that you've seen that you're like, yes, we need to do more of this. Like more universities need to do.
Yeah, so there was a special issue of American Quarterly, I forget, I think in 2018, don't quote me on that. But part of it was about attaching basically, yeah, so DOIs would get attached to different digital humanities or kind of digital projects so that they could actually count for publication. So I can see that being one of many routes. That's not the solution, but there are many to think about.
Yeah, sure.
The University of Minnesota has started a community engaged researcher track for tenure and promotion. So that, and then Rebecca Lave told me about something that they were doing in Illinois as well to kind of count these things. But to your point, Charmaine, about like when it can't even count because it's not going to be honest, it's not a thing, or it's not for public consumption. What I try to do in my own work is to use that learning to write and think about processes and relationships and dynamics that I can write about. And, for years I was going around giving a talk called The Brick Wall You Cannot See. It wasn't a very good talk, but it was about like all the things I couldn't say and do. And I finally broke through that because it was not a good talk, but really just to like really kind of think about like the learning that happens through that friction and identify ways that it can be applied to the processes that we're all interested in. So I've been working in Gullah Geechee Nation for 10 years. I've published 1 article that counts about that work, but it's informed all of my scholarship and just, targeted at urban theory or whatever, because I can write and publish about that.
Next question.
Hi, thank you. I just want to start with a thanks for all of your thoughts here, and also thanks for the last question from Charmaine. I have a related question because I am one of those graduate students who is interested in doing community engaged work for my thesis. I'm a master's student, and in particular, I was curious for your thoughts on doing community engaged work and going public with it up against this time frame that's expected for a thesis. In a master's program, I have funding for 2 years. So I've got some motivation to get my work done within 2 years, but community engaged work has to navigate these different metabolisms that the academics have, as well as what the community has. So I'm curious your thoughts about navigating that time frame where this thesis has a discrete beginning and supposedly a discrete ending.
Bob, you didn't get a chance to respond to that last question. Is there anything you want to say to that one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm a terrible example of someone sort of hitting the marks that they're supposed to hit in terms of sort of timeline. When I was working on my dissertation, I wound up spending a couple of years just working on an article. It wound up taking much longer than I thought. When I should have been working on my book, which I still should be working on, I wound up taking some time off to work on what became the Land Grab Universities project, with not much, with no guarantee that it would count to anything or be read or be used or be cited or be seen as scholarship at all. So it's a tough problem. And I don't have I don't have a great answer to it. My approach has been to do what I thought would have impact and what I was passionate about. And I mean, this is what I tell students to do. And I also think, that there are ways in which doing community engaged work, and especially collaborative work, does not have to be a drag on progress, right? I mean, if you think about it in terms of the projects themselves, this is certainly true for the Land Grab Universities project. If I had tried to just pursue this myself as a traditional academic work, I would still be working on it now. 3 years after we published this material. And the idea behind the project was, not that the idea was that it didn't have to close, there was no aspiration to close the door on studies of land grab universities or land grant universities and their connections to indigenous nations. We didn't want to have the last word, which is often what one's aspiration is when they write a book, right? They want to sort of close discussion of the topic for the next generation, right? The goal there was to put out enough information that could try to spur additional work by others. And that happened on an accelerated time frame because of the collaborative approach that we took.
Cool. Thank you.
Can I just say one quick thing?
Oh yeah, no.
I think in the case of graduates,
one long thing, or one longer.
one thing that I say to graduate students, PhDs and masters, is that is a time to have the 2-track model where you have 2 different products. One is I'm working with this community. These are things that they want and need, and you have time to, write white papers, make maps, do events, things that will resource them. And as long as you're accountable in the kind of analysis you're doing, then you just say, this is for academics. And, it's for getting a credential, and I'm not going to undermine you or do anything that you don't want me to do in it. But it doesn't have to be they don't have to be synced up. When I was writing my dissertation, I was mostly hanging sheetrock in Mississippi after Katrina, because I couldn't write about neoliberalism in a way that was going to help anybody in Mississippi, but I could clean up after the storm. And so, as you get longer timelines, as you get more resources, as you get different kinds of demands on your time, now I have no time and more resources. When I was a graduate student, I had all the time in the world and nothing. So, I think just having those 2 tracks where you're like, I know I'm doing something to resource this struggle and I'm trying to get a credential, and they're broadly on the same topic, but the master's thesis doesn't have to be the contribution to the struggle. That's how I would suggest my students think about that.
And I'm not a panelist, but I'm gonna give like a quick 2 cents addition to that, which is, I think, as someone, I've talked to a lot of grad students who ask a version of this question, something I thought about as a graduate student, but I think there's ways that we prioritize that depth as a sign of the value of our work. And when you're in a situation, like particularly in a master's program, like sometimes you have to realize, like, I can't do that in-depth project because it's not ethical, it's not responsible. I don't have that to give here because the stakes are too high for me. Right. And so I have to be realistic of like, I can think about ways I can engage outside the classroom in ways that will prepare me to do that later. But that we can overemphasize the value of trying to do that really in-depth research, because that creates vulnerabilities that then gets really complex to deal with in that kind of a project. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you.
We have a online question, it looks like.
Yeah, this is a question not so much about some of the confidentiality and privacy issues that have come up, but about transparency and maybe best practices for public accountability. So the question is, I'm involved in a forestry project. It's about implementation of SDGs in a municipal unit of the city in Japan. It's not so much about privacy and restrictions, but instead reporting the progress with foresting Satoyama activity to satisfy the city hall and get more citizens involved. So I think what they're asking about really is, again, is there some guidance or a body of thought about how best to do the work kind of, in real time with the public watching, both for engagement and for accountability to like a civic government. So.
Yeah.
I have one example that comes to mind that people might be familiar with is the Mapping Prejudice Project.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone is familiar, but it was an effort. It is an ongoing effort to map every racially restrictive covenant in Hennepin County, and now it's moved in Minneapolis, and now it's moved on to other places. And they innovated this technique to engage people in creating the data. And we subsequently did some interviews with planners and government officials who had used the data. And they talked about the fact that people could see the data being made and could look into and see the covenants themselves and could see the map getting made as it was getting updated as being a really important piece of the credibility and the conversation that the map opened up. And they talk about how that's really different from just being handed a map. This is where all the covenants are. And instead saying like, we made this data together and you saw it updated in real time. And that seemed to be really important to these planners for whom in this context, like covenants are critical race theory, essentially. So to go out into the planning universe and say that we're going to use this data, I think that having that real-time accountability and transparency helped gain credibility and
give authority to
yeah.
it, right? And we have about 5 minutes left in our time, so I'm going to call this maybe the last question.
The last question.
Well, we'll say there'll be space for people to have a last word.
I've been trying to figure out how to formulate this question for a while, but I think where the person goes who's the student who asked the question, that got me to think that was a great question. It really got me thinking about it, and your answer as well. And so I'm not going to do this in brief. I'm still a professor. So no offense to you guys, and I was thinking about mapping prejudice. I was thinking about the case of the Louisville redlining. I mean, I use all of these in my classes, and I use theirs in my classes. But no offense to you guys, actually with admiration, these are big, like glamorous, sexy projects, those of us in the audience, that you guys do. And you can't do that as a student. And sometimes you can't do that as a faculty member. And so I'm kind of been struggling with what does it mean to talk about being a community geographer and doing community work. The word research was in your title, but it's not always about research. It's about advocacy, or it's about learning, or it's about providing expertise, or sometimes it's just about labor. And I'm just wondering if you have examples or ways in which people can do this kind of work and get started, or people who've engaged. It's not a model of community research that's your perfectly seamless, what is a wonderful project this is at a national scale. Does that make sense?
Okay. No, I love that question. And I think that's actually really important. Because yeah, if you looked at our website, it looks really fancy. It didn't start out that way. But after 10 years, yeah. But the thing is that actually when we started as a collective, the idea was that we were going to make 1 or 2 maps and that was going to be it. And then archive that or keep it going somehow magically. And it wasn't supposed to become so big or fancy. But in those early years, actually, and still to date, I think, so we're part of a coalition called the Anti-Displacement Coalition in San Francisco. There are 20 or so different organizations involved. And regularly, like at least once a week, somebody emails being like, hey, can you make a map tomorrow for the city hall hearing? We need to see how many evictions are happening in each zip code. And so we do that, and that you don't see that on the website, but it's actually that keeps our communities and it keeps our community relationships alive and important. And sometimes people in our project get so consumed making this sort of fancy software tool that there are actually not enough people to do the work of making a map or doing some data analysis about something in a 2 or 3 day timeline. That's actually really important. And I think so many organizations that already exist need people to to join who have certain skills, whether it's map making or data analysis. It could be anything, policy analysis, because those are a lot of organizations are tapped. They need people with research skills who have shared political commitments to help. And so I would just make a plug for that. And I think it's a really good way to get started too, because I think we have this idea we always have to start something new. And sometimes the groups that exist just need some, kind of unglamorous behind the scenes labor to kind of keep going. So.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, the first story map that we made was with 4 volunteer undergrads who just showed up at my office and were like, can we do stuff with you? And so we were just like, okay, let's figure out what we could do. And then I got some money to go down to South Carolina, and the first story map was really not anything like what they are now, but what's, one of the things I say to my undergrad students is that I hold these relationships. And so if they work with me, they can do a little bit and it will add to the story map or it'll add to the project. And where it's hard is when you're as a student trying to hold the relationship or maintain the relationship and get that off the ground and keep it going and do that depth that Jerry was talking about. But instead, these things can become things that people contribute to over time. And I try really hard in my teaching to kind of give students opportunities to do little bits that feed in. But I would love, the original story map was not going to knock anybody's socks off, but it was fun. It was still really meaningful to our partners who had for the first time been able to kind of put sound and pictures and stuff up online. So I think having that kind of iterative opportunities is really important, and the digital stuff creates that opportunity, I think.
We're about out of time. I'm going to ask our panelists if they so choose, and you can pass on this if you want, to basically do a top 5 things you should know about public engagement. What's on that list that you haven't said already in a second, like a sentence or 2, right? Say a lot. While they're thinking about that, thank you all again for coming. This is our Community Geographies Collaborative Keynote. We're a specialty group. We're an online group primarily with through our website. And so you don't have to be an AAG member. We want you to contribute, but you don't have to join through AAG if you don't want to. We do host a variety of other activities. We're very much kind of figuring out where we're going with this. So I'd encourage you to join our community and be part of that conversation and that process. I also want to recognize a couple of things real quick. First, Jen Mapes and Valentina, Valentina were both part of organizing this. And so I want to give them some props for that. And thanks for doing this. Yay. Valentina is shaking her head, but you. And then I also want to recognize that AAG has a specialty or has a keynote support fund that helped contribute to everybody on the panel today, and I'm really grateful for that. So yay AAG for making that possible. Okay, so the folks, Bobby, do you have anything you want to say?
Yeah, a piece of advice. I mean, these types of projects. I don't think they can be finished on your own. It certainly would be very difficult for a graduate student to complete a project like this, but they certainly could start one. I mean, I started what became the Land Grab University's database as a side project when I was a graduate student. Ultimately, the project wound up taking several years, and even more critically, recruiting collaborators. It wound up costing in the end somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000 that we had to raise from various places. Most of that went to things like web development for the site. But it got started with the work, putting together the database and being able to show that to people and to recruit collaborators who were passionate about the project. But the piece of advice is that you need collaborators that aren't just passionate about the project, but that are good at things that you are not good at, right? There are certain things that I knew how to do related to GIS and historical research, and there are lots of things that went into this project that I have absolutely no idea about and couldn't have done with all the money and all the time, even if I had it. Things like the photographer that we had for the project, the web designer, the cartographer. These were all people that worked really on the cheap because they were passionate about the project, but because there was a group of really complementary skills that were being brought to the project, and that's what really enabled it ultimately to come to fruition.
Great, thank you. You either have something you want to say that you haven't said?
I would say maybe one thing to add is this is really hard, and I think it's a work in progress for a lot of people, but I think the better you can be, and that we can be about being real about capacity when working with community organizations is really important. I often see when people join the mapping project, they're like, I'm going to work on these 5 projects and like really, really overcommit. And then, because it's exciting and new, but to keep it going and to be real, like, oh, my capacity is decreasing next week, I won't be able to continue to work on this. Like that, those communications are really important. I think we're in a culture where people just ghost and flake, and that can be really devastating if you're the one person who has a particular skill needed to keep a project going. So that's just maybe a word of advice and something that I've seen, and I'm always trying to get better at too. So cool.
My last quick one is that there is no substitute for just being a good person. And so there's no rule book to follow, and there's no skill set you can have. You just have to be a good person and show up with good intentions and think and listen and be accountable and apologize and recognize your mistakes and keep showing up as long as you're invited to be there. And no, you can't teach that, right? You just have to go in with good intentions, because if you do not, that's when it will go sideways. And you can be a good person and it can still go sideways. And so that it's not a promise, but that is the thing that's like not really teachable, but is like the most important thing, I think.
Cool. This has been an awesome panel, y'all. This is a great conversation. Thank you again, everybody, for being willing to participate in this, and thank you all for being part of it. Give everybody a round of applause.